Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 543, A Day in the Life of Meiji Japan, Part 1. When we talk about Japan's Meiji period, there is a standard narrative we tend to use: the sweeping transformation of Japanese society under the leadership of the Meiji oligarchy, the corps of samurai from Satsuma and Choshu who won both the war against the shogunate and the bloody struggle for control of the new state that took place over the next decade and a half. As a result, as we know, they were able to direct the shaping of the new Meiji state and set Japan on the course towards becoming a great power, while also laying the groundwork for its disastrous defeat in the Second World War. It's a very important story, naturally enough, one that helped create Japan as it exists today, but it's also one that tends to leave out an important part of Japan's history. Until very recently, particularly in English-language academia, study of the Meiji period tended to focus heavily on the political and intellectual side of the era, on the people who were making the decisions that shaped the new Japan, and on the academics who pondered what it meant to remake a society to be quote-unquote modern. But that leaves an unimportant question unanswered. What was it like to actually live through these changes? If you were not one of the elite, one of the powerful, what was it like to live day to day in Meiji Japan? That's what the next 2 weeks are going to be all about, but first, of course, a few quick notes. First, these episodes are going to presume some familiarity with the history of the Meiji period, and in particular are going to be building off of ideas from episodes 531 and 532. These are the episodes respectively on the politics and the economic life of Meiji Japan, and in the interests of time, I'm going to avoid retreading that material for these episodes as much as I can. Second, the Meiji period is a fairly long span of time, 44 years to be exact, during which quite a lot changed. Obviously, I can't speak to all of that without creating something of a narrative mess. Daily life in the second year of Meiji would look very different from the 22nd year or the 42nd year, given how wide-ranging the changes of the Meiji years were. So, just to make things straightforward, I'm going to set my sights on the 33rd year of Meiji, which also happens to be the year 1900, by which point most of the policies and programs associated with the Meiji state were already in place in some shape or another, so we can talk about how they affected the lives of individuals. On a related note, when I initially pitched this idea to my beloved patrons, I initially framed it as a day in the life of Imperial Japan, but quickly realized that idea was just nuts. The Imperial period covers a period from 1868 to 1945 and would just be way too much to talk about in one episode. If there's interest at some point, I'd consider doing a day in the life of Taisho/early Showa Japan, or something along those lines, but I'm not going to try and tackle it here. Third, like many of my previous daily life episodes, this is going to focus more on life in the major cities like Osaka or Tokyo for two reasons. First, as is often the case, the major cities are just better documented. Second, one of the ways in which the Meiji oligarchy secured its power was by offering a grand bargain, so to speak, to the powerful landholders of Japan's countryside, most of whom were from the old social class of the Gono, or wealthy peasantry. These were families that had become wealthy enough during the Edo period to acquire a lot of land and set up by-employments like sake distilling or silk weaving, and rent out their land to peasants. They tended to be a lot richer and a lot better educated than other rural families and have outsized influence in the countryside as a result. So during the Meiji years, those rural families were allowed to keep their wealth and influence in the countryside in exchange for their support of the new regime. Many were appointed as government officials in the countryside on behalf of the new order. Once those jobs started to be elected, it wasn't hard for them to set up political machines that more or less guaranteed the family's perpetual power. As a result, changes to the countryside were a bit slow going. Modern technology to improve farm yields did of course come in, but the social structure of the countryside remained remarkably stable. It wasn't until the land reforms of the US occupation, which broke the power of these wealthy landholding families, that this started to change. I'm not saying nothing changed in the countryside during this period, mind you, just that the rate of change was a lot slower than the cities. Lastly, as I've already mentioned, this is going to be a two-parter, simply because there's too much to talk about in one episode. So, with all that said, let's get to it. You wake up on a lovely day in the 33rd year of Meiji/1900 in a major city somewhere in Meiji, Japan. What do? Well, first things first, breakfast, the most important meal of the day. Breakfast is actually a relatively recent innovation in Japanese history. For much of Japan's history, from what we can tell, 2 meals a day was a lot more common than 3. The first would be a mid-morning meal, roughly around 10 a.m., the second sometime in the mid-afternoon to early evening, usually around 5. There might be some variability based on occupation. For example, a farmer or physical laborer would usually eat at sunrise and sunset, and anyone doing particularly heavy labor might get a supplementary meal during the day, but largely this 2-meal pattern held for a good chunk of Japan's history. Starting around 1200, the aristocracy and court began to shift to 3 meals a day, likely under the influence of the Rinzai Zen monastic system, where consuming snacks with tea to keep people going during long meditation sessions had become the norm. For most people, however, the shift to 3 meals a day took place during the Genroku period around 1700, in the middle of the Tokugawa era, as average standards of living increased to the point where average people could, actually afford a third meal, and more importantly, as the economy developed to a point where food stalls were more common in major cities. This made it easier for those working a job to take a quick break and go grab an onigiri or something like that. I can't prove this, but as an inveterate caffeine addict, I also suspect that the shift towards breakfast had something to do with the growing popularity of tea drinking, offering an opportunity for a nice cup to get you going in the morning. So breakfast was already a thing by the time feudalism came to an end in Japan, but what it looked like changed a lot over the course of the Meiji years, and here already we can see the impact of the era's focus on modernity and civilization, the watchwords of the Meiji Era. These terms, of course, in the year 1900, carried the hidden connotation of Western, and even in the foods people were eating, you see the impact of Westernization on the Meiji Era. You see, a traditional high-end breakfast in Japan followed the old rule of ichiju sansai, or 1 soup plus 3 dishes, which were of course still staple fare for elite. These approaches would usually involve, as the name implies, a single soup, usually but not always miso, plus 3 other dishes, often rice, pickled vegetables, and some kind of fish. But that kind of meal is very time-consuming to prep. For most people, a bowl of rice was far more common, supplemented by some miso soup or pickled vegetables, perhaps. The fermented soybean mix known as natto was also a common breakfast staple going back to the Tokugawa years, particularly in the eastern half of the country, since natto is originally from Tokyo. Street carts selling natto during breakfast hours were common from the mid-Tokugawa period all the way to the 1950s. And here, by the way, I do have to get on my high horse and say, yes, I have eaten natto. No, I don't think it's that bad, honestly. Bit of soy sauce over some rice. It's not terrible. Alternatively, you could turn to one of the newer staples introduced from the West, bread. The Japanese word for bread hints at its introduction, pan, derived from Latin by way of Portuguese. Bread, of course, was first introduced by the Portuguese in the 1500s, but never really caught on given that whole rice agriculture thing being a comparatively big deal. Bread would not really have a resurgence until the Meiji Era. Specifically, in 1874, a man named Kimura Yasube, a former samurai who had turned to baking of all things, and opened up a bakery in the Ginza neighborhood of Tokyo, hit upon an idea. He would create a bread filled with anko, or sweetened red bean paste, which he thought would appeal to the palates of Japanese people better than more traditional Western breads, and he was right. Anko stuffed bread is still a staple today, and might be the kind of thing you'd grab from a stall in a hurry if you had the sort of job that didn't afford you the luxury of a sit-down breakfast. In terms of drinks to go with your breakfast, really the main option was tea. Coffee consumption wasn't really common until the post-war era, when American occupation troops brought it to the country. You might also have a glass of a bold new addition to the Japanese diet, milk. For a very long time, drinking milk from other mammal species just wasn't really a thing in Japan. There are some records of the practice going back to the Heian period, but mostly associated with steppe nomadic peoples from the north of China's Great Wall, where the pastoral herding of animals was a common form of sustenance, with milk drinking being a part of that practice. It wasn't really until the Meiji years that milk drinking was introduced to the Japanese populace at large. The biggest driving force behind that was something called the Gyuba Kaisha, a state-owned enterprise responsible for promoting beef sales. Beef as a staple food was also, of course, very new to Japan, brought to the country by Westerners residing in treaty ports like Yokohama. We'll have more to say about that next week. Anyway, the Gyuba Kaisha was set up in the early Meiji years ostensibly to control the supply chain of beef and beef products. More practically, it was a sinecure intended to employ recently unemployed members of the samurai class, and thus keep them from turning their martial skills against the new government. The Gyuba Kaisha was notorious for being very poorly run, but despite that did manage to use its government resources to do some promoting of this new type of consumption. The Gyuba Kaisha also produced pro-milk propaganda, a phrase I never thought I would say on this show, to try and promote the new drink. Here is an actual translated selection, quote, "For the effects of milk are even more remarkable than those of beef. Milk is a wonderful and indispensable substance for patients with fever or pulmonary tuberculosis, and for those whose bodies are weak, and it may be considered effective against every illness. To be used not only for illness, milk is drunk at daily meals in Western countries, and cheese and butter should also be used in the cuisine of our country in the same manner as katsuobushi, which is dried bonito shavings if you don't know it. By utilizing milk to live a long life, maintain a healthy body and invigorate the mind, the Japanese shall save their name from dishonor." The patriotic rallying cry to save Japan from national dishonor through milk drinking proved only marginally effective, shockingly enough. As you might gather from that ad copy, milk was initially promoted as a health food for those who were ill. Nor did the call to make milk or butter as ubiquitous in Japanese cooking as katsuobushi, which is like a core component of Japanese cuisine, prove particularly effective. Other than the sick, the most common buyers of milk in Japan during the Meiji period were women with nursing-age children, particularly those who were having a hard time nursing themselves for whatever reason. For these women, cans of condensed milk, or even pasteurized milk once that was introduced around 1900, were way more affordable than hiring a wet nurse, which used to be the only other option. Despite this valiant effort to save Japan from national dishonor, milk drinking never really became common during the Meiji period and wouldn't really take off in any substantial way until the US occupation, when a lot more Western-style foods were introduced to Japan, and the economy grew to the point that milk became more consistently affordable. There are, of course, a few other reasons why dairy consumption remained relatively uncommon during this period. Rates of lactose intolerance are generally thought to be higher among people of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent, and particularly during these earliest years, many of the dairy products coming to Japan were coming from overseas, and had a tendency to go off in transit. Bata kusai, stinking of butter, was actually an insult during the late Edo period and early Meiji periods, describing someone who would be willing to eat anything that smelled that bad just because it was trendy and Western. More generally, Western foods did tend to be the domain of the elite simply because they cost more, which meant that breakfast itself also had some class politics attached to it, depending on whether you were having some anko bread or some natto or what have you. Wealthy types usually ate Western breakfasts and looked down on the boorish commoners who couldn't afford this modern fare, while said commoners jeered the wealthy for their slavish adherence to modern Western cuisine. So okay, picking breakfast proved a little more politically loaded than maybe we were expecting, but that's okay. We're nice and full. I, your loyal guide, will be totally fine with tea instead of coffee. That's a lie, I won't be. So I'm gonna run off to the nearest coffee shop, and as for you, you should probably get your day started. Adults, of course, have work to get to. So what might you do for a living during the Meiji years? Well, your options would vary quite a bit, and much of that variability really had to do with education. Japan's Meiji period more or less coincides with one of the biggest changes in the history of Japanese education pretty much ever. For much of human history, education was the domain of the elite, not just in Japan but around the world. In Japan, it's true that the Terrakoya, schools run by Buddhist institutions, had histories going back to the 1500s, but the Terrakoya were also not really full educational institutions in the sense we think of them today. They taught basic literacy so the pupils could engage with Buddhist holy texts, and some basic history, geography, and mathematics on top of that, but the offerings were a lot more limited than, say, what was available to members of the samurai class at their domain academies, or what a wealthy merchant family could afford for their children with private tutors. However, by the time of the Meiji period, a new trend had started to sweep through Europe: universal education mandated by national governments. The history of why universal education came to be is a bit beyond us here, particularly because the systems that exist today developed in different ways in different countries, influenced by each other, yes, but also very much on their own trajectories. Suffice it to say that, particularly as modern national governments started coming together over the course of the 1800s, their leaders found it advantageous to begin pushing for nationwide mandatory schooling as well. Schooling, after all, had a few big advantages for a modern nation-state. First, it ensured a basic level of knowledge for all citizens, useful, of course, for making sure that they were informed, active members of their local and national communities, but also making sure that they had some basic skills for participating in the national economy. Schooling was also a useful way to mold the minds of impressionable young people, forging in them a sense of identification with their national governments rather than the localities they resided in. The role which education played in helping to train up generations who bought in, so to speak, to their national governments was noticed by the first Japanese travelers overseas during the late Tokugawa years. It's not a coincidence that the first text to really bring the Meiji period scholar Fukuzawa Yukichi to prominence was his Gakumon no Susume, or an encouragement of learning. Indeed, for guys from the same social class as Fukuzawa, mid- and low-level samurai, national education was kind of a dream come true. Many of them had felt stymied in their ambitions and talents by the old social system, which privileged feudal family rank above all else, even in the education system, and felt that a national education system offering the same opportunities to all would be more meritocratic, allowing men of talent, naturally like themselves, to rise to the positions of influence and leadership which they deserved. Thus, one of the first priorities of the Meiji state became the creation of a national education system. The education ministry itself was set up in 1871, just 3 years into the Meiji period. The early plans for national education were both wildly ambitious and, let's call them, mixed in terms of success. The Education Systems Ordinance released in 1872 envisioned an American-style education system with 3 levels: elementary, middle, and university, run entirely by the national government. The Education Ministry would set up 32 middle school districts and 210 elementary school districts, with most of the elementary schools being old Terrakoya Buddhist academies, and most of the middle schools being former Hanko, or samurai domain academies. Everyone, boys and girls, would be required to attend the elementary level at their local schools. Only the best and brightest boys, and just boys, would test into one of the 32 middle schools, and only the best of those would make it to one of the 8 universities set up by the central government. The government poured a lot of resources into this plan, both to construct these schools and hire foreign experts, mostly teachers and educational theory instructors, to get things up and running. But again, the results were mixed. Actually getting anyone to enroll their kids in school proved pretty hard. By 1882, after 10 years under the new system, enrollment was actually only around 50% of where it was projected to be. Which maybe wasn't the worst thing, because much of the infrastructure to actually support the system didn't exist yet either. In particular, of those 8 national universities that were supposed to train the best and brightest, only one, the University of Tokyo, was in place by 1877. Before long, the Education Ministry began a series of overhauls to the system that I won't bother you with too much, because looking back on them, it's pretty clear that nobody really knew quite what they wanted to do yet, at least until 1885. In that fateful year, Japan's government switched its basic operating model. Previously, the Meiji government had operated using a lightly revamped system based on the Ritsuryo governments of 1,000 years earlier, with the Dajokan, the Supreme Council of State, handling the actual running of government. However, that model proved a bit lacking in its flexibility, and so in 1885, a cabinet system based on the parliamentary governments of Europe was set up for the first time, and one Mori Arinori was appointed education minister. Mori's reforms would remake the system from the ground up, and if you were a kid headed to school in Japan in 1900, your experience would be very much shaped by Mori's vision. Mori envisioned a 4-tiered structure for education consisting of the elementary, middle, normal, and university levels. The elementary section, of which only 4 years was mandatory, was intended to teach very basic skills like literacy and arithmetic, but also had one important function. You see, criticisms of the very first Meiji educational systems had been plentiful, but one of the most common critiques advanced primarily by nationalistic conservatives had been that the system was too liberal in its mindset. They wanted an education that was more explicitly patriotic, teaching young people to sacrifice for the nation, and more traditionally Confucian, emphasizing the importance of respect for hierarchy and authority. And Mori Arinori, who was very much nationalistic conservative himself, agreed. Borrowing liberally from Imperial Germany, also the model for much of the new Japanese constitution, he organized an elementary school curriculum that was much more nationalistic than had previously been the case, and in particular added one new subject to the existing compulsory ones like history and arithmetic. This was dotoku, or ethics, but not ethics in the sense of studying ethical theory or anything like that. Ethics class was more like a civics class, the civics of how to be a good subject of Japan's emperor. Somewhat ironically, Mori Arinori was actually assassinated in 1889 on his way to the ceremony where the emperor was to proclaim Japan's new constitution by a right-wing zealot who felt that Mori himself was not sufficiently reverent to the throne. Said zealot must not have been familiar with the ethics curriculum because, just to give some examples, it involved the memorization of the emperor's rescript on education, promulgated in 1890 and a central part of the educational system, to the point where every pupil was expected to memorize the archaic Japanese it, like all imperial proclamations, was written in. They were often beaten if they made mistakes. That rescript outlined the, quote, fundamental character of education based on deeply and firmly implanted virtue, as well as loyalty and filial piety. That virtue in turn required that students, quote, be filial to your parents, affectionate to your brothers and sisters, as husbands and wives be harmonious, as friends true, bear yourselves in modesty and moderation, extend your benevolence to all, pursue learning and cultivate arts, and thereby develop intellectual abilities and perfect moral powers. Furthermore, advance public good and promote common interests, always respect the Constitution and observe the laws. The actual curriculum of these classes wasn't much different from the content of the rescript. Textbooks consisted, for example, of summaries of classic myths around the origin of the imperial family from the Kojiki, written in simple language, or platitudes on becoming a good Japanese through self-sacrifice, diligent work, and respect for the national anthem. Once rendered appropriately patriotic, those who tested well at the elementary level might get a chance to go to an elite secondary school, which was really a combination secondary school and college prep class. These schools were essentially 2-tiered institutions with a combined 7-year program. The first 3 were equivalent to graduating from a more traditional middle school and covered what you might call advanced technical skills. You then had to qualify into the last 4 years, which were basically college prep. Students who did good work in this system might get a chance to go to a normal school, a school intended to train teachers. There they would be trained to help educate a new crop of students and, of course, make sure they were appropriately patriotic. Students who did great work went to university, with the goal of the national universities led by Tokyo Imperial University being to train the brains of the new Japan for roles in the government bureaucracy, politics, or other leadership positions. Mori Arinori was also the one who renamed Tokyo University to Tokyo Imperial University, specifically to emphasize the role the school and those like it played in supporting the current regime. Private universities did also exist at this time, but it wasn't until 1918 that they were officially recognized as alternatives to the public system. In other words, you could go to one, but doing so would limit your job prospects, particularly if you hope to work for the government after graduation. Of course, the system was modified after Mori set it up. For example, over the course of the 1890s, the government set up vocational secondary schools to run apprenticeship programs, 23 such schools, train industrial workers, 113 of those, or train students in agricultural, industrial, and commercial technology, 83 of those. These were schools for those who didn't test well enough to get onto the university track at the end of primary school. Instead, they were to be tracked into the blue-collar workforce. A growing number of women's secondary schools intended to train women in the government-endorsed virtues of Ryosai Kembo, the good wife and wise mother, were also set up over the course of the Meiji period, and eventually women's-only industrial secondary schools got set up too. The number of years of compulsory education would also steadily be expanded until all 6 years of primary school and the first 2 of lower secondary school were required. But broadly, the core structure Mori Arinori created would endure until the post-war education reforms imposed by the United States. Primary school was intended to cultivate a baseline of skills and, more importantly, a baseline of patriotism. Secondary school was intended either as vocational training or tracked into college prep, universities were for training the national elite, and normal schools were for generating the professional teachers who made the whole system tick. Ostensibly, this was a meritocratic system. You were sorted into one or another track based on your educational talents, a notion that appealed to many in the Meiji leadership who, of course, were big into meritocracy because of the bad hand they felt they'd been dealt in the old feudal system, and because of the social Darwinistic views that tended to be very prominent in Western society during this time. For the more culturally conservative, the strong Confucian emphasis of the ethics classes, with their language of reverence for the state and reverence for one's parents, was very desirable. After all, for a Confucian thinker, those two forms of authority were closely linked. For the more Western-minded members of the Meiji elite, of course, the ostensibly meritocratic structure was their ideal for education. Many of them had been very frustrated as members of the lower samurai class, and were invested in the idea of a system that promoted men of talent rather than privileging social status. Again, the role of social Darwinism is also important to take into account when we speak about this system. The idea that life itself is a sort of struggle that sorts the strong from the weak, with education being intended to reflect that idea. That notion, which involves the application of Darwin's ideas of biological natural selection and survival of the fittest to fields like sociology and political theory, has fortunately been largely discredited today. It's associated with political beliefs like fascism, as well as eugenics and pseudoscientific racism. However, in the late 1800s, social Darwinism was very fashionable in elite circles in Europe in particular, and of course it would be, because the theory told those in power that they were there because of their own strength, and not just because they were rich or had lucky parents. The reality of the Meiji system is that it wasn't very meritocratic. It really served to reinforce existing social inequalities. Because the system was tracked from such a young age, around the time you'd go into middle school, you were sorted either into the vocational or the white-collar college prep track. In practice, it tended to reflect the social class and academic training of a kid's parents, which generally is the biggest predictor of academic success. And switching tracks was so difficult as to be functionally impossible. If a kid who went into the vocational program because they had a rough start in primary school was later found to actually have an aptitude for university-level work, well, that's tough. This in turn was reflected in enrollments in the university system. In 1900, that system was still dominated by the children of the former samurai. Even though that particular social status had been abolished for decades at this point, the advantages samurai families had come into the Meiji years with, in terms of pre-existing access to education and a baseline of economic achievement, meant they still predominated in higher education. It wasn't really around the time of the Meiji Emperor's death in 1912 that Tokyo Imperial University, for example, had a majority commoner student body. Looking at this system in action, it's hard to argue it was a meritocracy. It was much more of a reflection of existing class disparities, a lot like, frankly, the Edo period education system. It was just that the social classes themselves had also changed. Once you were out of school, you were bound for the workforce, and here again your experience would be very different depending on where you ended up. Broadly, there were 3 tracks you could find yourself on. A university graduate was pretty much guaranteed a job among the elite, either in the state bureaucracy or a political party or a similarly prestigious field. Alternatively, if you left after the bare minimum of schooling, you were likely to end up with a job that, frankly, was not very different from what your ancestors had been doing a century earlier. The Meiji economy, as we talked about in episode 532, was very much 2-tiered. Strategic industries run by major corporations got the lion's share of attention and funding from the state, but they were also a small sector of the economy. And I do mean small. As late as 1930, only 20% of the population worked in any industrial setting. Particularly in the countryside, very little changed, except for the fact that industrialization really widened the wealth gap between farmers and city dwellers. The countryside got poorer and poorer from a relative perspective as the Meiji period went on, except for that class of landholding rural elite who of course did very well based off the rents they were paid by their tenants. As for industry, what did exist looked very different from what you might imagine, and this is where we get to the third of those tracks. The real driver of Meiji industrialization was not heavy industry, things like steel, but light industry and especially textiles. And that was an industry dominated not by men, but by women. Textile mills weaving cotton and silk were crucial for the government's economic strategy. Those fabrics could be sold overseas for a profit and the money reinvested in quote-unquote strategic fields, like steel, which were seen as important to national security. For most of the imperial era, cotton and silk were Japan's 2 biggest exports. As early as the 1870s, government propaganda encouraged young women from all social classes to take jobs in textile mills out of a sense of patriotic duty, serving for a few years to bring money to their families and wealth to the country, in the same way their brothers were doing when they were conscripted. More on that next week. The conditions at these textile factories were generally brutal. 12-hour workdays, hideously unpleasant conditions. Wages were not great either. In the 1880s, just under 20 yen a year was pretty standard, with the rest of the earnings being remitted to the parents of the women who signed up. Because remember, under the Meiji system, the family patriarch had a lot of power, and that included the ability to both indenture their children into jobs like this, potentially against their will, and to garnish their wages, so to speak. As for the specifics of the conditions, I'm going to quote at length from Janet Hunter's article, Japanese Women at Work, quote, "The conditions were extremely unhealthy, the air was permeated with dust fumes and the atmosphere was intensely humid. In the silk reeling mills, reelers' hands were constantly exposed to the boiling water in which the silk cocoons were placed to soften them. Safety conditions were minimal at least until around 1914, and toilets and other hygiene facilities totally inadequate. Workers were frequently penalized for not paying sufficient attention to their work, for taking time off to go to the toilets, or for talking to other workers. In early days, many workers were not permitted meal breaks, having to eat their meals next to their machines, often keeping them running." Hunter then goes on to quote from a government report describing the dormitories in which these women lived. That report describes immaculately laid out dormitories that house 700 women at a time. As late as 1926, lighting and ventilation are terrible, residents suffering from extremes of hot and cold in the summer and winter, the nutritional standard being extremely low, and employers actually confining employees to the factory compound as a part of their whole employment contract, even retaining a part of their wages to keep them from leaving the compound itself. Lest you think this is exaggerated, here's a report from a different government inspection going through a silk mill in 1903. Quote, "Girls are not free to go out of the mill. In the Suwa region, for example, they are normally banned from doing so. If permission is granted because of some mishap, the worker is supervised by an official who accompanies her. When a mill does have fixed times when workers can go out, it is usually for 1 hour after the evening meal, with no more than 5 girls allowed out any one evening. In mills lacking a bath, girls are sometimes allowed to go out together at a specified time to go to the bathhouse, but in all cases, exit permits have to be handed over. By the way, none of this also mentions the rampant tuberculosis, which is a huge problem in these cramped dormitories and was responsible for 40% of the deaths within the dorm system on average. And yet women signed up. After all, this is one of the few opportunities many of them had for a job where they could make their own money even if they couldn't keep most of it, and where they could live independently without either their fathers or a husband watching over them. And that's kind of a depressing note to end on. We'll pick up next week with some very different career paths and a little bit more on the food culture and entertainment of the Meiji period. But for now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fisheye Catch Our Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks also to new patron Multiman for donating to support the History of Japan Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for Part 2.